So let's talk about the great and the good of the Emperor's Faithful, with a tier list of Adepta Sororitas units in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Sisters, and in this video I thought we'd do a tier list overview of Adepta Sororitas units, talking through some of the squads and war machines that I think are stronger or weaker in-game right now in this new post-Codex world. At time of recording this, it's still fairly early days for the Sisters Codex. The book's been out a few weeks and the points have been out for a couple of weeks, though there has been enough time for a bit of early tournament data. Sisters have already won 2 grand tournaments, so there has been a little bit of time for people to put theory crafting into practice. It looks like the Bringers of Flame detachment does seem to be by far the dominant one in terms of competitive play. That certainly seems to be pretty successful, given that those 2 grand tournaments were both won by Bringers of Flame list, with fast-moving shooty Sisters on the go. I say that literally all of the other detachments look interesting and playable though, and for the most part I feel like the majority of units in the Codex are at least usable, though maybe better in certain detachments than others. Feels like overall as 10th edition codexes go, Sisters really haven't done too badly. As always, tier lists in Warhammer 40k are a little bit arbitrary. Some things could be ranked a little bit higher or lower depending on your army, context or personal playstyle, and things can vary for all sorts of other reasons, whether you're playing in a bit more of a casual or competitive scene. And maybe more than anything, in 10th edition, each detachment basically would have its own tweaked tier list, some units just being super standout in certain detachments more so than others. Perhaps the most obvious datasheet locked one for the Sisters of Battle is the Penitent host, where basically anything with the Penitent keyword gets massively better, and it does feel like a fair few of those are more sort of costed for that detachment as opposed to general purpose. For this one, I'm probably going to have a fairly heavy focus on Bringers of Flame, given that it seems to be the one that most people are gravitating towards. I'll try and mention a bit for the other detachments as we go along. Certainly some units get some good stuff out of things like Hallowed Martyrs and Army of Faith as well. In any case, with all that in mind, here are the Sisters units sorted into a rough 5 tiers worth of power, starting with the weakest and ending with the strongest. First up, and still probably one of the weakest datasheets in the Codex, is the Dogmata. She's the only one that I've chosen to rank in Tier 5. Just feels like a datasheet that needed some sort of update or boost in the Codex, but basically got kind of unchanged. She's 45 points, and she gives a +1 objective control for her unit and a -1 leadership debuff up close, plus a little bit of melee at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2. Sisters have loads of great support characters, and I think that realistically she's just not going to get picked versus them most of the time, even if she is quite cheap at 45 points. I think perhaps one of her main issues is that she's kind of reliant on Fragile Sisters squads surviving on the front lines with the enemy. The OC is only going to be relevant if the enemy contests an objective but doesn't manage to destroy the Sisters units, and boost to it might often be a bit better on things that are really tanky and you almost know are going to survive the enemy's punishment. Kind of similar for the leadership thing, really, where the enemy needs to be super close to take effect. I still feel like she's probably not going to be too major a drag on our list if you already wanted to include one for fun and style purposes, but I think realistically you're probably going to be better off with just about any of the other characters. Next up in Tier 4, I've put 2 Overshadowed datasheets. Seems there's really not that much excitement for Sisters Melee at the moment. I feel like the Repentia got some really interesting buffs to their datasheets, but then Games Workshop handed them a massive great big points increase to go alongside them, which really hurts them in their sort of jump in, kill something, and trade unit kind of role. They hit the enemy brutally hard with sustained hits now, and reroll hits and wounds. They are pretty general purpose combatants, with those Eviscerators and the reroll wound roll means that they should have a good chance of even a 5-woman squad doing something like 9 wounds or so to a standard battle tank, and being fairly devastating against things like standard Space Marines with 2 wounds. Their main issue though is that they're just ridiculously fragile for 18 points each. Overwatch can be a big issue and kill half of them with a volley of small arms fire if you get unlucky. And even if you do manage to do the delivery to get them into combat, there's at least a reasonable chance that they just kill something of a similar sort of points level as themselves and then just get taken down fairly easily in return. I think they do get far better in Penitent hosts, as all of the Penitent keyword things do. You can get character leaders for them, like the Palatine if you just want ridiculous damage, and nice things like Advance and Charge, or big damage boost or speed boost from the core detachment rule. And just about any melee of the other detachments will work out pretty well for them too. Overall, just feel like they're a bit overcosted. I feel like their damage output genuinely isn't even that bad at 90 points, but they're just ridiculously fragile, and don't seem to be the way that most people are going for Sisters damage dealing right now. Otherwise, perhaps one of the other units that I've seen people least excited to use on the tabletop are Celestian Sacrosants at 75 points per 5. They did gain some much needed datasheet damage boosts in the Codex, getting lethal hits on the maces, and a big boost in attacks on the halberds. Since pre-Codex, the damage has got a lot better, and they're one of the very slightly more sturdy Sisters units getting a 4+ invulnerable save baked in, plus their -1 to wound thing that they've got going on. I still don't think that gets them to the point where they're overall tough though. I feel like they're still perhaps one of the more interesting choices for a bunch of characters to lead. They can get some good stuff out of everything from Canonesses with Blessed Blades to Palatines with lethal hits combined with their halberds maybe, and there's plenty of things from various detachments that can make their melee a bit better. In general though, despite the big melee damage boost, people don't really seem to be as excited for them as other things. I feel like Zephyrin for the extra 15 points are quite a big contender as they move so much faster, and can get power swords with lethal hits for that unit as well. But I still think they're pretty playable casually. I might have been a bit borderline between ranking them tier 3 or tier 4, whereas Repentia maybe feel like are a bit more solidly deserving of being down here outside of Penitent Host. Moving on to tier 3, here are units I maybe consider a little bit more middling, quite usable, but I feel like they're probably going to be niche for most army lists. Exorcist is a big 190 points now, but comes with some fairly fearsome indirect shooting. It lost heavy in the Codex, but that kind of doesn't really matter too much given that it's only going to be hitting on a 4+ or worse anyway now. And having d6 plus 2, strength 10, AP 3 and damage d6 rockets fall out of the sky is pretty scary for a lot of opponents. That is a profile that's going to worry whatever it takes aim at. I guess situationally triggering the Battle Shock or Deadly Demise on a 5+ could occasionally be relevant, but it feels like kind of a weak rule for 190 points worth of artillery. Indirect fire is still pretty awesome in 40k in general, just being able to snipe out things that the enemy cares most about, particularly if there's not much of it around at the moment. It means that enemies might have plenty of things that try and rely on being out of line of sight for survivability, and the Exorcist could definitely punish that. It's clearly paying a massive premium for being able to do so though. As a result, I feel like at the moment it's perhaps costed in the place where you could use them, but I feel like the majority of people aren't going to. Next up, we've got the Penitent Engines and Mortifiers. Penitent Engines are 75 points and Mortifiers are 70. Both have a fair few similarities, being 5 wound toughness 6 walkers with a 5+ feel no pain. They get a bit of heavy firepower with flamers or heavy bolters, and some nice buzz blades in melee. I've seen far more people running the twin-linked strength 10 AP3 version than the flails. Mortifiers get to hit on a 3+, they get to fight on death on a 2+, and get an anchorite. The Penitents get to advance, shoot and charge, so have a much bigger threat range, but they do pay the extra 5 points for that. Compared with pre-Codex, they did have really quite a big points increase without too much extra gain. The Mortifiers got the sustained hits, I guess. And smallish units can be quite nice for things just like Miracle Dice, or forcing the enemy to attack you in Hallowed Martyrs. But for vehicles that are often going to be exposed to a bunch of enemy firepower before they make combat, I feel like they're priced at a bit of a premium for most detachments currently. I sort of rank them middle-ish for the majority of detachments, though far better in Penitent Host, where I'd probably put them top tier. Those movement and damage buffs that you can get on the core rule are amazing, plus being able to advance and charge, or automatic advance 6 inches and charge like the Penitent Engine, the distance that they can go is pretty ludicrous in that one, and feels like those very high points costs are far more tempting in that detachment compared with the rest. Otherwise for tier 3 I've put a bunch of characters here as well. The Hospital is 50 points. I feel like she's kind of interesting as her special rules are really quite powerful, but in general I think they'd be a lot more powerful in armies that aren't Sisters of Battle. She gives her unit a 5+ feel no pain, so they will be genuinely a bit more tanky against small arms fire with damage 1, and you get to heal 1 bodyguard a turn, or D3 + 1 bodyguard if you can expend a miracle dice. She's certainly got way better since pre-Codex, though it feels like she's still going to be unlikely to be the first choice as a bit more of a reactive character rather than one that boosts damage. I feel like a lot of Sister squads out there are more going to be jumping out of transports and hitting the enemy hard with damage output straight away, and they're not really being too hard to take down in return. And I'm not sure that 50 points worth of trying to boost their durability and hoping they survive to allow you to restore models is really going to be worth it when your squad might just die anyway. Though I guess if you had a big investment combo with a Canoness or Palatine on the go, you could throw her in there as well to try and give that squad every single chance of survival, but still overall the big offering that you get when you have 2 expensive characters plus a Battle Sister squad or something is still going to be very fragile for the points. Overall certainly not bad, and if your opponent does fail to kill a unit, then restoring somewhere between 2 and 4 Sisters with that fail no pain save intact could be absolutely massive. but again, I feel like she's going to be outcompeted by the special characters that add more damage for the most part. I feel like it's perhaps a similar sort of thing for the Imagifier. She grants her unit a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save. Again, that does make the actual Battle Sisters genuinely more tanky. Perhaps if you had a big threat unit, that one could give you a bit more of a chance of surviving the counterpunch, perhaps particularly in Bringers of Flame, where you could use that AP debuff stratagem. If you could get that and cover, it could genuinely lead to a squad surviving when otherwise they might have died. You also get to reroll miracle dice for units being destroyed within 12 inches, which I feel is nice, but a bit of a peripheral benefit. Again, I feel like the Hospitaller, it just depends on whether or not you can afford to invest this many points in just trying to keep a Fragile Sisters squad alive. Even if you're buffing basic Battle Sisters, then your unit's going to still be like 180 points worth of models. And it maybe feels a little bit weird to have 10 extra tanky Battle Sisters when you could have put the same points towards like another 5 more Sisters elsewhere who get their damage output as well as their defense. Still seems pretty usable though, and I feel like that defense rule genuinely is really quite impactful. Next up, we've got the Ministorum Priest for 50 points. The new version combining the two old datasheets gives you +1 to wound in melee, plus a bit of personal threat with the Zealot's Vindictor, some attacks in melee, plus a Ministorum Flamer sort of profile, and they can get a fair bit more fighty for one turn with their special rule. The only real dedicated melee unit that they can buff are the Arco-Flagellants, and they feel like a bit of a take or leave unit for that. Otherwise, kind of interesting that they can scout or infiltrate with Dominions or Novitiates, respectively. I kind of feel like neither of those units are really the ones that want the +1 to wound boost, though. And Novitiates with Infiltrate often want to be just kept cheap as more expendable screening type units. They're a pretty central character for Penitent Host as well. And again, a rate top tier there for Enhancement Bearing and making Arco-Flagellants more dangerous, as they're going to be super important in that detachment. Overall, I'd say usable enough, though. They'll probably just use for Arco-Flagellants to make all of those fail attacks +1 to wound, maybe borderline between tier 2 and tier 3. Finally, for this one, we've got Astrid Thurger and Agathe Dolan, 85 points for the pair of them. Astrid with her auto tapestry of the Emperor's Judgment, and Agathe her Holy Word Goblin Attendant. They give out the rather powerful boost of devastating wounds both at range and melee. The range bit was new since the Codex, and that could be kind of fun with miracle dice around. Could be pretty spectacular to put an automatic 6 into a multi-melter and have it just blast straight through invulnerable saves. Kind of massive there. And Agathe farms miracle dice whenever their unit slays another, or D3 when she gets cut down. I feel like the buffs definitely are interesting, but 85 points is a kind of big investment versus things like a Caranest or Palatine, both of which I feel give you some pretty massive buffs in their own right. Feels like maybe Celestian Sacrosancts could be interesting, though as mentioned they feel like they're a bit overcosted right now, and I feel like Astrid Thurger and Agathe probably could do with going down in points a little bit themselves. Before we jump into tier 2 things, just a quick shout out to the discount retailers down in the video description. If you are looking to pick up any Sisters or any other Warhammer 40k kits, there's a bunch of shops in the video description that give anywhere between 10 and 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures, and if you did buy stuff through any of those, it does help out Auspex Tactics a little bit and keep all these videos coming. There's a few around the world, including Element Games in the UK and Wargame Portal in the USA, and can just be a way to save a bit of money on a generally quite expensive army. A big thanks to any people using those when they do decide to pick stuff up. Moving onwards and upwards though, here are the units that are ranked in tier 2 for the Sisters. First up, we've got a standard Holy Battle Sister squad at 115 points. Their special thing now is to bring the Sticky Objectives rule and also have the ability for multiple different characters to attach to them. So it can have some interesting combos of characters in one squad, such as maybe a Palatine plus Dialogus, or having one of the durability characters in with something to make the squad more dangerous. Their Miracle of Dice farming ability became a more general thing for the Simulacrum Imperialis, so that's no longer quite as much their special bonus. They're still perhaps a little bit better for miracles than most with the Cherub that they get, which maybe could make them a bit more interesting in Army of Faith. Previously they tended to be kind of auto-include, though it seems that a lot of Sisters lists are choosing to take either one or none of them now. Sticky Objectives is quite a good rule, and you can use an Immolator to break the squad in half, so you get 2 quite small, efficiently objective-holding units with OC2. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a bit more love for Dominions going forward, though. Next up, we've got the Holy Prophecy Angels of the Zephyrim, 90 points per 5 or 180 per 10 of them. They move fast and have mass power sword attacks with either lethal or sustained hits each turn. Quite a nice boost that they got in the Codex there, and they can have both of those rules on the go if you're willing to expend a miracle dice against the right top tier target. Quite nice to have a melee unit that can get itself where it needs to be really quite quickly. They're a fairly central unit for the Army of Faith with the stratagems that they can use, and several detachments have some nice melee buffs for them, such as being able to get extra AP. They perhaps seem like one of the more obvious choices if you want to run a fighty jump cannoness, though Seraphim are rather godly right now. And the jump cannoness can be really quite fighty in her own right, with, say, the halberd, her once per game big attack special rule, plus certain enhancements on the go. Overall, I feel like compared with several of the other units, I feel like they're usable given their speed, and they are generally quite threatening to a lot of units with the lethal hits, but 90 points still seems just a bit high for the overall offering. Perhaps just not really quite scary enough for how fragile they are, at least in comparison with the other units. Next up, I've put the Retributors at 125, typically being armed at quad multi-melters, which can make great use of miracle dice. They get to reroll wound rolls of 1 against all targets, or gets to reroll all wound rolls against things that killed a Sisters unit earlier in the game, though it does mean that you do need to have a system of this of Sisters Judgment marking tokens if you have Retributors on the board. They maybe do feel like a bit of a detachment-specific unit, far better in Bringers of Flame compared with elsewhere, though given that Bringers of Flame seems to be the dominant way to play Sisters, at least early post-Codex, that doesn't really seem to have worked out as a bad thing for them. One of the first Grand Tournament winning Sisters lists used 2 units of these with multi-melters. I have seen them used in others as well. It looks like overall their sheer damage threat is enough to have them make the cut. I guess assault keyword melters with strength 10, likely jumping out of immolators or rhinos, are enough to do the business. They are just kind of hilariously fragile for the cost though, really needs to get their damage done in one big attack. As if the enemy has any sort of damage output, they're going to be a ridiculously high priority. Next up, we've got the Chain Flail Freaks of the Arco-Flagellants, 45 points for 3 of them, but most people tend to use them in 10s for 150, needing a bit of a critical mass worth of melee attacks. They'll run quite fast up the board and hit you with 60 attacks at strength 5 AP 0 with their extremist trigger word with their sustained hits, though they aren't twin linked anymore, so they won't be stacking quite as many saves against truly tough stuff out there. Their Feel No Pain dropped down a bit to a 5+ rather than a 4, though they did gain a 6+ invulnerable, so it wasn't all bad on that front. And overall, just feel like a squad that's still very nice for just throwing loads and loads of attacks at the enemy and deleting lots of lighter infantry units and stacking saves on anything bigger. Again, they'll like just about everything from the Penitent Host and are a little bit harder to kill in return versus some of the other Sisters units out there with multiple wounds and a good Feel No Pain. I'd rank them top tier in Penitent Host, and getting that +1 to wound from a priest seems reasonable enough if you want to go for a big investment unit of them. That will be quite a pricey melee unit though, at 200 points or so. Next up for 100 points are the Sisters Novitiate. These are an infiltrate unit to take the mid-board early and basically feel like a sort of light threat unit that really pays a premium for that infiltrate rule. They get 2 Minister and Flamers, 1 Banner and 1 Simulacrum for helping you farm some miracle dice early, and then a bunch of melee weapons where they can reroll hit rolls against things on objectives, which I think is okay, but they're still not really going to be much of a threat against anything besides lighter infantry. In general, I'd probably take either one or none of these. Depends on whether or not you want the infiltrate style units to start up the board and have the option to screen out the enemy in matchups where it matters. Say if they've got a lot of annoying scout moves or scary infiltrators or something, and just having some bodies on a midfield objective with the Simulacrum trying to generate some miracle dice early seems reasonable enough as well as being in a good position to do secondary objectives. I think between all of that, maybe one squad of them is kind of fine, though I probably wouldn't go more. Next up, we have the Demonofuge herself, Ephrael Stern at 85 points, plus some filthy Xenos. As it goes, I feel like they're quite useful as lone operatives, fairly cheap at 85 points and fairly high wound count between the two characters, plus Carganel getting slain might mean that there's a bit of overkill out there that doesn't fall on Ephrael Stern. They've got some okay melee threat that all threaten medium infantry type units, and fights first makes them kind of annoying to take down for certain lighter armed things. Hopefully you'll be able to take a chunk out of them before they go, if they even manage to destroy you outright. And maybe not the most convinced about the mortal wound ability being battleshock dependent, it's not super reliable even against Chaos Marines annoyingly. And otherwise they have free heroic intervention, which could be interesting in supporting other Sisters units. They do get to fight first, though that one generally feels just a little bit situational. In general, at 85 points I feel like they're handy enough to have, fairly playable. They're likely competing with the Imperial Assassins, which can also do lone operative things, the Calidus for bouncing around the board, or maybe the Vindicare for sniping, or the Elisor for fast-moving lone operative scouty type things. It's just useful to have units that can't be shot at long range to either hold down points for guaranteed, or be able to screen out parts of the board. or to be a small cheap unit to do secondary objectives. Next up, I thought that Celestine ate a slightly unfortunate points increase from the Codex. She jumped from 130 to 160 without really gaining much. She herself gets 5 attacks at Strength 6, AB 3 and Damage 2 with Devastating Wounds, backed up by her 2 Gemini with Power Swords. Her main trick is her 2+ chance to stand back up on death, which can be kinda big. It's pretty annoying to have a character that can move really quite quickly that you know you can't kill in any one turn, unless you give the opponent the chance to both shoot her to death and then follow up with a charge. Means that she'll be in a position to either do objectives or go around destroying lighter units in the next turn. She can also set up bodyguards really quite quickly as well, healing D3 of them to get those Gemini back on the board quite quickly. And it's maybe a bit more relevant than some in the Army of Faith with the jump pack keywords to allow certain stratagems. I do feel like 160 points is a big ask for her now though. She was kind of low threat in terms of damage anyway, even when she was back down at 130. I haven't seen many people choosing to play her in competitive lists at this points cost. Feels like she's probably just a little bit overcosted versus the competition right now, I'd say. Not sure if she could have been a bit borderline between tier 2 and tier 3, which is kind of a shame given that the datasheet's really quite good. Again, it just maybe seems like the points cost is a bit on the high side. Finally for this tier, I've chosen to rank Junith Arita, the 90-point Canoness on big hover pulpit equipped with some big twin flamethrowers below. The main thing that she brings to the board is farming up command points, 1 CP on a past leadership test on a 6+, or you can burn a miracle dice to guarantee it if you don't have anything better to dispose of junk miracle dice with. Extra command points I think is really quite a big deal given how good the sister's stratagems tend to be, and then beyond that she can give -1 to hit for a unit. I feel like post Codex for her 90 points, given that she's now 8 wounds with a slightly better toughness, and her big 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable, she's not really too bad just to have literally just running solo in the backfield. Maybe hanging around a home objective for a turn or two, generating up some command points, and between the heavy flamer and the big mace that she does have enough threats to be able to push away lighter enemy units trying to deep strike in the backfield if she wants to. Overall seems pretty usable between her stat line and her command point generation. I think there's enough value there to justify 90 points. Finally though, we're getting into tier 1. These are the units that I'd rate as top tier for the Sisters of Battle right now, ones that I think are likely to make up the mainstay of competitive lists. First up, we've got the Angelic Host of the Seraphim, 85 points for 5 of them or 170 per 10. They can deep strike and move, shoot, move, which are both really quite interesting for being able to do secondary objectives. They can move really quite quickly to get around the board to places that the opponent might not be able to expect, potentially 24 inches in a turn with advance in Bringers of Flame as they can shoot with the Assault keyword. The Hand Flamers were kind of good before, given that Bringers of Flame is the most popular of the detachments, then they're just taken to the extreme next level. They can have 46 Strength 5 Hand Flamers per unit of 5, which is kind of brutal. And getting the Assault keyword to get them in range is really nice as well if you're not deep striking them. And then they can even be a massive damage threat in their own right, even against tougher stuff with that Torrent Devastating Wounds one. I've seen at least a few people use the Jump Canoness with the +1 flame hit enhancement, and then having either 8 or 9 Hand Flamers in the unit. So something like 36 Strength 5 hits with Devastating Wounds means that you should be getting around about 6 or so. They can certainly combo pretty well with the Jump Canoness. They're pretty central for Army of Faith as well, with the Jump Pack stratagems and that extra AP one that they can get. And absolutely solid in Hallowed Martyrs as well. In general, I'd expect most lists to take at least some Seraphim in some capacity. Next up, we've got the Scouting Sisters of the Dominions, who really got an improvement in the Codex, I thought. 115 points for 4 sisters with either melter guns or flamers, plus a full 10-man squad, and then perhaps one of the best choices to split in half with an immolator, putting all the scary guns actually in the tank itself, and then having the other smaller units perhaps to do things like camp home field objectives with the simulacrum to rustle up miracle dice, or just be another annoying chaff unit on the board. They get to advance and shoot with their weapons just natively, even outside of Bringers of Flame, so they can have good threat range with all those special weapons. They get to scout up the board, including with attached characters, which means they should be in a very good position to strike, again particularly in Bringers of Flame. Really nice to get a lot of Melter and Flamer fire to the opponent's front lines turn 1 if you want to. And their special rule is quite a nice one as well, a good reactive movement, which means they could potentially hide out of line of sight, or maybe even re-embark in their transport, which could be pretty disruptive. Potentially meaning that if they're close enough to the opponent that they have to move around, then they might be having to destroy the immolator to be able to deal any damage to them. Bringers of Flame also helps out their damage as well. Strength 10 melter within 12 inches is big. and gives them a few more options for transport stratagems or strength 6 flamers if you're using that loadout. Overall, a pretty excellent unit that gets next level in the most popularly run Sisters detachment. Next up, I've chosen to rank the Paragon Warsuits here, which I'd still probably put a little bit more borderline Tier 1 or Tier 2, but given that More Than Val's so great, I thought I'd include them here, given that lots of armies seem to be running them both with her and them. For their 210 points, I think their worst thing is their durability. Toughness 7, a 2+ save, and a 4+ invulnerable is okay individually, but for the points cost it really isn't all that great. But certainly post the Codex update, they really bring just excessive amounts of damage. Likely multi-melters, grenade launchers, plus the warblades now being the way to go, that they got their special rule. They get the +1 to hit and wound against monsters and vehicles, which is excellent for the mid-strength melter and grenades, and the warblades just seem to be by far the best way to go in close combat now that they have that. They'll still be wounding monsters and vehicles on a 4+, and they don't have to take the bad AP that the maces come with. Basically, they'll make a mess of anything that they get to shoot and charge against. They're just very dangerous but really quite fragile against enemy anti-tank fire or special weapons. They really need to use terrain intelligently, or maybe use rapid ingress. Bringers of Flame can help them out as well with worsening AP by 1 for a stratagem. That can make them really quite tanky if they can get a cover save as well. Overall, absolutely masses of damage, but a bit short-ranged, and likely to be a huge target priority for any opponents out there. If they can get into a few important units before they get targeted by too much though, they're likely to have a very good time. Hand in hand with them is More Than Val herself, 160 points for the High Abbess, and she grants the next level reroll hits and wounds for Paragon Warsuits, just doubling down on making them just ridiculous damage. You could be having multi-melters that could be wounding toughness 12 things on a 4+ and then re-rolling that wound roll, so the vast majority of hits are going to convert, and they'll pretty much be hitting every time with a 2+ to hit and re-rolling the 1. She also chips in with some longer range damage herself with her missile launchers and heavy bolter, which might be able to hit things a bit further away than the Paragons can reach. And in melee, she's got quite a nice well-rounded attack of Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 3, which again will get the +1 to wound against vehicles from the suits now. She can now activate the +3 attacks with a Junk Miracle dice, which does mean it does have a cost to activate now, but means that you can do it multiple times if it makes sense to. Overall, I feel like they're really quite scary in basically most of the detachments. They can be a really good focal unit for doubling up miracles on in Army of Faith. Bringers of Flame could have them advance and keep up that very scary melter fire. And Hallowed Martyrs helps her out personally quite well. If the squad does get shot down, then she's perhaps the best target for that Revive on Death stratagem that they have, potentially being restored at below half strength, and ready for a brutal turn of further carnage with +1 to hit and wound. Next up, we've got the Sisters Transports, the Immolator and the Rhino. Transports almost always being really important for Sisters of Battle, just given that they're the sort of army that gets on best with them. Really fragile units that you want to have an armoured hull protecting, then often being kind of slow moving at just 6-inch movement, normal infantry, and wanting to be super close, whether it's to deal damage with flamers or in close combat. It just means that transports tend to get on with them really well. Despite the change with the wound rerolls thing that the Immolator had, it still seems that they're the transport of choice to go for, taking multiples in most competitive lists. They have heavy firepower, often using the multi-melters, though I think that the Immolation Flamers certainly aren't bad either for the anti-infantry clearance and the Overwatch. And now their special rule allows them to strip cover from a key target, really nice for certain low AP things like bolter fire, perhaps particularly from castigator tanks with their heavy bolters perhaps. Beyond that, as I mentioned, for a couple of units, they can split units in half, which is a pretty big advantage. Means that you could have the scary half of a Dominion squad in this and make it scout forward to get those melters in range nice and early, and then leave the other half of the units to do more objective and action type things. Again, it's just a nice cheapish screening unit, generally handy to have smaller squads for more miracle dice when they die anyway. They also could get on pretty well with Retributors with a small capacity as well. They're easily enough threats to warrant the transport, and they want to get close while being super fragile as well. Again, they're just massively relevant for Bringers of Flame. They can have Assault and Strength 10 on those multi-melters, which can be pretty massive against battle tanks, and then several things that directly support transports with various stratagems for some shenanigans and movement tricks. Not really too hard to see why lots of armies are taking multiples of them in that. At least for Bringers of Flame, it looks like lots of people are taking Immolators over Rhinos with the extra utility it has. I still think Rhinos are absolutely fine for the 75 points though, better for bigger units like Repentia or Arcoflagellants if you're using them. Or if you want to do a big cool character combo with say multiple characters attached to a regular Battle Sister squad and get them into the field in safety. They do have their own advantages as well, such as self-repair and having a firing deck, plus a little bit of anti-infantry threat with Storm Bolters and a Hunter Killer missile too. Next up, the Castigator seems to continue to win 10th edition for the Sisters, basically been great ever since the edition came out and hasn't really stopped. It only got a very tiny points increase in the Codex despite all the buffs that Sisters in general got, and even got a pretty fun supporting rule thrown in for its trouble. The Castigators come with 3 heavy bolters and then usually a battle cannon on top, though the autocannon's still not awful. The battle cannon just often seems to win out in people's estimations for the ignored cover. It's just quite nice to have that kind of firepower in complement to the things that the Sisters bring, which tends to be a lot of very, very scary melter damage to deal with tough stuff and high saves. Heavy bolters can help out against things like 2-wound infantry with low saves. The battle cannon's fairly general purpose, and all of it can be at really quite long range as well, so it doesn't need to get too close, unlike a lot of other units. I feel like its AP debuff rule is pretty nice, and can be interesting in that it can help out a second Castigator really quite a lot. I feel like they work kind of well in pairs. Essentially getting AP2 on the battle cannon and heavy bolters for the second one just feels so much more threatening, and you can even hand out that debuff rule just by pinging a heavy bolter into another unit. Again, Bringers of Flame can be pretty nice for them. Being able to advance and shoot can be great for getting crucial lines of sight when needed, and getting strength 6 heavy bolters definitely isn't nothing when up close as well. Next up, for some other Sisters characters, we have the Caroness and Jump Caroness. The regular one's 50 points, and the Jump Caroness is 75. I feel like they in general won fairly big from the stratagem changes that Games Workshop did in the balanced data slate, meaning that they can now use basically all options for their units and just reduce the cost of the CP by 1, and Sisters have got quite a lot of powerful buffing options to choose from. I think it does kind of depend on the unit being led, but the on-foot one is really quite cheap and can save on command point cost, and then you can either have extra melee from a Blessed Blade which gain lethal hits, which is rather nice, or double down on the buffing abilities with reroll ones from the command rod. Could be nice on Dominions or Retributors or some big Battle Sister squad combo. They will be competing against things like the Palatine with her lethal hits and her melee buffs. Otherwise, the Jump Caroness looks like she's been very popular in army lists since the update happened. Perhaps particularly interesting in Bringers of Flame for all those torrent devastating wounds that you can get out of a Seraphim squad. If she takes a Hand Flamer herself, then you could have 9 Hand Flamer attacks coming out of that, which is just going to barbecue hordes and stack loads of devastating wounds on the enemy, even if they're tough. And despite not really being all that hard to kill, Jump Canonesses can be incredibly fighty as well. Maybe taking the Blessed Halberd and getting an extra 3 attacks out of it, and then taking one of the more fighty enhancements that they can. Extra strength and damage could be a pretty massive deal on that in Hallowed Martyrs. Overall, nice to see the actual Canonesses being a bit more focused. I think the stratagem change was quite a good one, really. Otherwise, for the Sisters Lieutenant, the Palatine is 50 points. She gets a quite cheap and quite direct damage boost in lethal hits, which is pretty great for just about every Sisters unit. For the most part, literally anything that she can lead tends to have a strength lower than 10, which means against monsters and vehicles they're going to be wounding on a 5+ a lot of the time. Getting lethal hits against something that you're wounding on a 5+ in a vacuum gives you a plus 50% damage boost. Having lethal hits with multi-melters and things can be an interesting choice for Miracle Die 6s as well. If the enemy's got a bad save, then basically guaranteeing a hit and wound with a melter out of a small unit could make them punch up massively. And it looks like there's a fair few other interesting combos that she can do. Maybe joining Repentia in the Penitent Host for some massive critical lethal hits combos going off. And she's quite a nice choice for any enhancements that help her fightiness through Suffering Strength as basically the new name for the Old Blade of St. Eleanor in the Hallowed Martyrs detachment. That means that she can get really quite scary between her own damage and her mortal wounds, or maybe using that Righteous Rage one in Bringers of Flame. Being able to feed in Miracle Dice for a particularly impressive round of combat out of a cheap support character is fairly nasty. Overall, I still rate her as one of the strongest leaders, though probably has a bit more competition from the on-foot Caroness after the Codex. Otherwise, for cheap leader characters, the Dialogus is 30 points. She comes with a battle shot cancelling rule, which occasionally could be useful, but I feel like the big thing is swapping a Miracle Dice used on the units to a 6, meaning that you can expend some bad rolls to get some automatic big results. Again, this can make multi-melters do some pretty silly things, particularly if you take her next to the Triumph of St. Catherine and use the multiple different miracles rule it has, or use the Army of Faith where you get that army-wide. Means that you could have her in a squad of battle sisters and convert a single melter hit into an automatic wound and then an automatic 6 damage if you had 2 miracle dice. If you're in melter range, then that's basically 8 wounds on a big target that the opponent can't really do much about unless they've got an invulnerable save. As she's a cheaper support character as well, you could combo her with other characters, maybe the Palatine being a particularly nice one for the lethal hits that they can do. And overall, I feel like she is just quite good value for this role. Being only 30 points is significantly cheaper than a lot of the other support characters, and I think her rule's really quite big mechanically. Finally, we've got the great big funeral procession that is the Triumph of St. Catherine itself. It went up in points enormously in the Codex, that got an enormous boost to its special rules, basically having tweaks on what it did before. There's some very useful buffing auras all around it, and then getting its main special rule to be an automatic 6 miracle dice each and every battle round, which is just fantastic value given these 6s can have so much use. Anything from locking in long charges, big wounds or damage results on melter weapons, or even bouncing saves on castigators against some ludicrous damage attacks maybe. Then for the rest of the model, it's at least somewhat tanky and hard to take down, an interesting 18 wounds at toughness 3 with a 4 plus invulnerable save, and then has the choice of 2 genuinely quite good buffing auras to help out the Sisters of Battle nearby. I feel like the movement one is actually one of the more interesting ones. Getting +2 to move and then +1 to advance and charge can mean things could go really quite a long way across the board. That could trigger some pretty crazy deployment zone to deployment zone charges in things like Penitent Host, and certainly doesn't hurt melter weapons getting in range as well. Otherwise, that multiple miracles aura within 6 inches is quite a big one too. That means that you could do combos as mentioned with the Dialogus, converting one single melter gun hit into damage far above what it would normally do on average, and then just some nice straightforward buffs to melee durability or range, all of which could absolutely be the right choice depending on what the board's looking like and what units it's supporting. The Triumph certainly seems to be seeing a bunch of competitive play in the first week or so of grand tournament results and things, and looks like it's going to be a pretty competitive model to come given the miracle dice and those awesome buffing auras. In any case, though, I think I'll leave that there for this one. Look forward to hearing all your takes on the Sisters of Battle units and how you've been finding them post Codex. Are there any units that you would have rated a bit higher or lower on this? I look forward to hearing any thoughts as to why. I'll hopefully aim to do a video on some Sisters of Battle army lists at some point, so feel free to stay tuned if you'd like to see that. In any case, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new 40k videos most days. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.